Imagine it's 1494. Just 2 years earlier, Christopher Columbus had landed on the shores of the New World with a Spanish expedition, mistakenly thinking it was India. That's when Europeans suddenly realized the world was much bigger than they had ever imagined. Vast territories opened up that seemed like they belonged to no one. Why fight over so much open space? To peacefully divide and develop these new lands, the two main naval powers, Spain and Portugal, decided to settle it amicably at the negotiating table. This is how the Treaty of Tordesillas was born. They simply split the still unexplored world in half. Portugal got Africa, Asia, and a tiny slice of South America. Spain received the lion's share of both Americas. If you had been there 5 centuries ago, you probably would have picked America too. But back then, no one knew what treasures these continents held. As it turned out, the Spanish had drawn the winning lottery ticket. The western coast was literally covered in silver mines. For the next 300 years, roughly 80% of the world's silver came from the areas that are now Mexico, Peru, and Bolivia. This made Spain the richest empire on the planet. The silver rush pushed the Spanish farther south until they reached the mouth of the Rio de la Plata. Mild climate, fertile soil, absolute paradise. There must be silver here, the colonists thought, inspired by legends from local tribes. Their belief in quick riches was so strong that they named the land Terra Argentina, Silver Land in Latin. They never actually found silver there, but the name stuck forever. Since they had already settled the place, no one wanted to leave. The Spanish started growing cotton, tobacco, and sugarcane. True to habit, they also began exploiting the local population. They brought cows, sheep, and horses with them, which multiplied rapidly on the endless plains with their lush pastures. Fat, hides, and wool became the colony's main sources of wealth for many years. The main hub was the port of Buenos Aires at the mouth of the Rio de la Plata. It was the perfect location. Direct access to the Atlantic, plus a whole network of navigable rivers leading deep into the continent. As usually happens with colonies, Argentina gradually grew stronger, while relations with Spain only got worse. The mother country appointed its own officials, kept locals out of power, and ran policies purely in its own interest. This went on for centuries. In the early 19th century, the British tried twice to seize Buenos Aires, not to colonize it, but to control the key port of South America, force trade with England, and weaken Spain. The Argentines repelled both invasions on their own, without any help from Madrid. This naturally led people to ask, why do we even need Spain if we can defend ourselves? Then, in 1808, Spain fell under Napoleon's control. On May 25, 1810, patriots in Buenos Aires staged a coup. They removed the Spanish viceroy and created the first junta, a temporary self-government. The junta only controlled the capital, though. The rest of the regions pulled in different directions. Some supported the revolution, others stayed loyal to Spain, and some dreamed of full autonomy. Full independence was declared only 6 years later, but the internal power struggles among the elites continued for many more decades. In the end, the former single colony split into independent countries: Argentina, Paraguay, Bolivia, and Uruguay. By 1911, Argentina had caught up with Western Europe in GDP per capita, Germany, France, the Netherlands, countries with huge colonies all over the world. It seemed like it had firmly joined the club of the world's richest powers and would stay there forever. But this economic miracle had a dark side. The very things that had lifted the country, mass immigration, foreign investment, and strong raw material exports, would soon become its curse. The world gradually stopped seeing Argentina as Latin America's paradise. Can a country be considered successful just because it sells a lot of goods abroad? At first glance, yes. Exports bring in money, create jobs, and open doors to the world. But there's a serious trap here. When an economy depends too heavily on exporting raw materials, it becomes extremely vulnerable. If buyers turn away, the whole system starts to shake. Argentina mainly supplied grain, beef, wool, and other basic agricultural products. Everyone needs these goods, but they can easily be replaced by dozens of other suppliers. Meanwhile, the United States, Germany, France, and Britain were already producing complex industrial goods, locomotives, machinery, and equipment. that required technology, capital, and skilled workers. Falling behind at that level means staying behind forever. And that's exactly what happened on October 24, 1929, the famous Black Thursday. The Great Depression began in the United States. Americans sharply cut back on purchases of Argentine exports, which made up 10% of the country's total exports. The crisis quickly spread around the world. Western countries, which bought more than 70% of Argentine products, drastically reduced imports. From 1928 to 1932, Argentina's export volumes fell by nearly two-thirds. Government revenues collapsed along with them. The country that had recently been called the future United States of the Southern Hemisphere suddenly started falling apart before everyone's eyes. But the problems weren't just building up outside the country. Inside Argentina, things were boiling over too. The most generous conditions went to the first waves of immigrants, those who arrived in the 1860s, 1880s. The huge wave that came in the early 20th century had it much harder. Good jobs were almost impossible to find, and land was barely given out at all. To clear new territory for farming, the government launched a full military campaign in the early 1870s called the Conquest of the Desert. Indigenous people were driven out by force. The seized lands were sold off immediately. As a result, nearly 9 million hectares, roughly the entire area of Portugal, ended up in the hands of just a few hundred people. Politicians, generals, and the wealthy elite of the capital. Out of more than 2 million immigrants who had arrived by 1914, only about 30,000 received their own plots, less than 1.5%. And even those plots were tiny. Everyone else either worked as laborers for big landowners or crowded into the slums of Buenos Aires. A typical family of 5 lived in a 4x4 meter room, sharing one kitchen and one toilet with dozens of neighbors. When there are too many people and not enough jobs or fairness, crime starts to rise. By 1914, the city that had once been called the capital of the future had turned into a breeding ground for pickpockets, racketeers, and street thieves. Social tension grew every day. Then the main source of prosperity, exports, collapsed. The budget was falling apart, wages dropped to almost nothing, and tens of thousands lost their jobs. All of this was happening under an old, sick 78-year-old president who was completely out of touch with reality. On September 6, 1930, a plane flew over Buenos Aires dropping leaflets. The Army and Navy openly demanded the government's resignation. A small force led by General José Félix Uriburu calmly entered the capital. The city didn't resist. On the contrary, people greeted them as heroes. Crowds cheered in the streets as if it were a holiday. This was Argentina's first military coup, which later became its sad trademark. It happened with almost no bloodshed and with widespread public support. But no one yet understood what was coming next. With Uriburu's rise began the so-called infamous decade, 1930 to 1943. During this time, 4 presidents came and went. All of them were corrupt dictators who ruled in the interests of the military, big landowners, and British capital. Uriburu immediately suspended the constitution, dissolved parliament, and ruled with an iron fist. The new authorities tried desperately to revive agricultural exports. In 1933, they signed a very unfavorable deal with Britain. Britain removed tariffs on Argentine grain and set quotas for beef. But almost all the meat had to go through foreign, mostly British, meatpacking plants. Prices were low, and in return Argentina agreed not to raise tariffs on British industrial goods. It was a real blow. The country had just started moving from pure agriculture toward industrialization, and now it was pushed back into the raw materials trap. Cheap British goods flooded the market, making it unprofitable to develop local industry. On top of that, Britain remained the main investor. More than 60% of British money went into railroads, the only decent way to move goods to the ports. The agreement gave a short breathing spell. From 1933 to 1937, exports in dollars doubled. But then the decline started again. Argentina never managed to escape its dependence on raw materials. Britain gradually shifted to its own colonies, Canada and Australia, and lost interest in making further concessions. People and the opposition saw this pact as a betrayal of national interests for short-term gain. A former colony that had just begun to taste normal life was quickly sliding back into dependence. During these 10 years, a new generation of young officers grew up in the army. They were furious about the corruption and the power of the old elite. They formed a secret organization and began preparing a new coup. One of the key figures was Colonel Juan Domingo Perón. On June 4, 1943, while World War II was raging, an 8,000-man force entered Buenos Aires. They captured the Casa Rosada presidential palace in just a couple of hours. The president was removed with almost no resistance. Unlike the 1930 coup, when the military simply swapped one set of backers for another, in 1943 they came to seriously change the country. And the rising star of the new regime was Juan Domingo Perón. World War II put Argentina in a very advantageous position. Staying neutral, the country sold grain and meat to all sides of the conflict. Food prices skyrocketed, foreign reserves grew rapidly, and the balance of payments hit its highest level in 40 years. For the first time in a long while, the government had real money, and it was in the hands of a man who knew exactly how to spend it to win people's hearts. Perón sharply turned toward supporting ordinary workers. He introduced a minimum wage, strict price controls on food, and free education. Simple respect quickly turned into a full-blown personality cult. Perón began to be called the blacksmith of the great new Argentina. In 1946, he won the presidential election in a landslide. The state apparatus became a true ideological machine. Government positions went only to proven loyalists. Newspapers were censored, and television was fully nationalized. About 2,000 university professors were simply fired so no one would dare criticize the reforms. Perón's main goal was complete economic independence. The state began massively buying and nationalizing key industries: telephone services, electricity, gas, transportation, ports, and insurance. Money that used to flow abroad to foreigners and the old elite would now work inside the country. But the pleasure came at a very high price. Just buying the companies cost 6 billion pesos, about $1.5 billion at the 1947 exchange rate. For comparison, that's roughly the same amount France received from the United States under the Marshall Plan over 4 years of post-war recovery. The loudest deal was the purchase of the British railroads for 2.5 billion pesos. The country seriously overpaid for old, worn-out infrastructure. Even Perón's chief economic advisor later called it a pile of scrap metal at the price of gold. When the golden times of World War II ended and the reserves started to dry up, Perón found a clever trick. He created a state monopoly called the Institute for Trade Promotion. The institute bought wheat and meat from farmers at artificially low fixed prices, then sold it abroad at world market prices. The difference went to subsidies, social programs, and industrialization. On paper, it looked brilliant. In practice, abuse began immediately. Quality didn't matter. The main thing was to make money on every deal. Once, instead of normal tractors, they bought 7,000 weird contraptions. Jeep engines bolted onto metal frames. They couldn't even plow a field. After 1949, world food prices fell and the institute went deep into the red. They solved the problem the easy way. The head of the institute also ran the central bank and simply turned on the printing press. At the same time, Perón launched a massive import substitution policy. Down with dependence on the West. We'll build everything ourselves. New factories were handed over to our people, often with no experience or skills. The companies operated at a loss but received generous subsidies. The printing press never stopped. This is the classic populist scenario. Wages rise, prices are held down, but inflation creeps up quietly. In 1946, it was 19% a year. By the end of 1951, it had jumped above 50%. People's savings literally evaporated. On June 16, 1955, during a big rally in support of Perón, military planes appeared over Buenos Aires. The Navy began bombing the city center. 364 people were killed. It was the only air strike on the Argentine capital in history. Perón survived by a miracle. Soon afterward, he resigned voluntarily and went into exile, first to Paraguay, then to Spain. The country was split in two. What followed was a real political soap opera that lasted 20 seasons. In the next 20 years, there were 3 military coups, guerrilla warfare, street riots, the banning of Peronism, Perón's return in 1973, his death a year later, and the rise to power of his wife Isabel, the first female president in the world. In 1975, Celestino Rodrigo became economy minister. In just 49 days, he managed to finish off the already broken economy. He devalued the peso by more than 100% overnight, sharply raised utility, transport, and gasoline prices, while increasing wages by only 38%. Inflation soared above 300% a year. This triggered a general strike. The military didn't miss their chance. In 1976, another coup took place. A junta came to power. They appointed José Alfredo Martínez de Hoz, a millionaire and big industrialist, as economy minister. He decided to cure industry with harsh liberalization. He removed almost all import tariffs and opened the borders. Cheap imports flooded in. The peso was artificially strengthened. Local industry, which had lived under protection for decades, collapsed. Production fell, unemployment doubled. To save big companies, the state took on their debts, about $17 billion. To distract people from the economic disaster, the junta launched a little victorious war in 1982. They seized the Falkland Islands, Malvinas, from Britain. Quick euphoria turned into a humiliating defeat. 2 months later, Argentina surrendered. It was the final nail in the coffin of the dictatorship. Democratic elections were held in 1983. Then came new attempts to fix the country. In the 1990s, under Carlos Menem, they pegged the peso to the dollar. Inflation almost disappeared. GDP nearly quadrupled in 10 years, and investors cheered. But imports grew faster than exports, debt soared, and in 2001 came the freezing of bank deposits, massive riots, and the largest default in history, $82 billion. In 2002, 5 presidents changed in 2 weeks. The peso lost 2 times its value. Debts were later partially restructured, but vulture funds still won billions in court. In 2015, Mauricio Macri came to power. More liberalization and removal of restrictions. Inflation returned, debt grew, and in 2018 came a record IMF loan of $57 billion. In 2020, the third default in 20 years. It seemed things couldn't get any worse. But in 2023, a man with a chainsaw stepped onto the stage, Javier Milei, an economist who promised to cut government spending and get rid of the parasites in politics. People were tired of 40% poverty and crazy inflation. Young people dreamed of only one thing, leaving the country. Milei won the second round with 56% of the vote. He immediately began harsh shock therapy. He eliminated 9 ministries, cut tens of thousands of public employees, closed a huge budget hole, and completely banned printing money. Inflation slowly began to fall. Milei wanted full dollarization, but eventually proposed a system of competing currencies. People themselves decide pesos, dollars, or crypto. He openly praises Bitcoin as protection against the evil central bank. True, in February 2025, Milei himself got caught in a big scandal. He promoted the Libra meme coin, its price skyrocketed and then crashed 96%. Thousands of people lost their savings. Trust was shaken, but the opposition couldn't push through impeachment. Today, Argentina is the eternal cautionary tale. In the early 20th century, it was one of the 5 richest countries in the world. Investors seriously chose where to put money, in the United States or in Argentina, the land of the future. Now it's more than a century of decline. They tried absolutely every economic model. And every time the same story repeated itself. If only the wealth hadn't been stolen and competent people had been in power, today we might be talking about Argentina as one of the leading economies on the planet. But history doesn't have a what if. All we can do is learn from its mistakes. The next time someone offers you a simple and quick solution to all problems, just remember Argentina.